Okay. So we will jump down to slide 3. Okay. So Paul, you've obviously provided background to the process, and actually when we joined earlier, I think Ross was talking a little bit about the research process as well, and probably explained it. It was a multi-stage research program involving both input from trade and consumer sides, plus some reasonably detailed supply-side research and analysis, from which we were wanting to draw some conclusions about opportunities for differentiation. Now, at the time that the research was first discussed and planned, I don't believe anybody anticipated quite how significant the impact of COVID-19 would be. And even in the early stages of the program, when we discussed how that would impact the research, again, I think none of us would have anticipated sitting here in 2020 with the tourism industry really globally in tatters. Now, can you just check the recording, okay? So I think it's probably fair to say that destinations around the world are taking the opportunity to pause and reflect on the redevelopment of their tourism industries, including in New Zealand, where we have a Tourism Futures Task Force looking at the sustainability of the sector and what changes might be required as the industry develops. So I think it's probably fair to say that for specific destinations in general, we need to be thinking about the opportunity is not necessarily to return to where we were, but to build back better, or to look at improve on where we were in 2019. The research told us that prior to COVID,
oh yeah,
pretty one-dimensional view of Pacific Island destinations, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But what we saw was pretty limited differentiation between destinations. Yes, there are clear points of difference, but perhaps not as well developed as they could be. Limited engagement by visitors in destination, and I think as a consequence of that, because consumers see relatively little difference between destinations, there was this sense that if you had been to one Pacific Island country, you had kind of been there, done that. So there wasn't this sense that that there was more to be discovered in other Pacific destinations. This visualization draws together some of the findings from the quantitative research that we did that looked at the attributes of different destinations across the Pacific and the kind of activities and experiences that were associated with those destinations. And what you can see from there is that that dominance in the top left there of simple, relaxing, welcoming, peaceful, family-friendly, coming out very strongly in people's perceptions. And then in the bottom right, a focus really on a fairly limited set of activities and experiences available across the Pacific, particularly beaches, diving, snorkeling, swimming, and staying in resorts. So a much less emphasis on many of the other activities and experiences that the Pacific has to offer. what we also found from the qualitative research that we did was that that had been heavily driven, or those perspectives on Pacific destinations had been heavily driven by word of mouth, by social media, by travel review websites, and also by high-profile campaign activity, particularly activity that focused on all-inclusive package deals, a price-driven marketing, I guess, from across the region as a whole. It was also very much people were drawing on their personal experience, and I think that the point there is that because people had a set of expectations about the Pacific, that you travelled to the Pacific for relaxing, a week in the sun, staying at a resort, because that's the expectation that people have, that kind of very one-dimensional perspective. They weren't necessarily seeking out activities beyond that. So you have a sense of perception and experience reinforcing each other. And because people are having relatively limited experiences in the Pacific, when they go home, they're sharing effectively what they've seen and done, which often is very little outside the resort gate. Looking ahead, I think from what we can see, there's definitely value in taking a fresh approach, or perhaps looking with a different set of eyes as to where the opportunity might be. And that's about amplifying destination differentiation and creating a much more multifaceted view of the Pacific region, encouraging visitors to do more in destination, to experience more in destination, and as a consequence of all of that, giving the market more reasons to visit more destinations more often. Now, there are, particularly going into the next few months, or however long it may be, next few months to a year, there are obviously some really significant challenges of supply relating to airline connectivity, to channels of distribution, and also, importantly, to activities and attractions in region that have all been significantly impacted by COVID-19. So not to understate or underestimate those challenges, I think the point still is worth making, that we have quite a unique window of opportunity to readdress the market and to reframe the way in which people think about Pacific Island destinations. Firstly, undoubtedly we have a really receptive audience, and the research that we did in Australia and New Zealand indicated that coming out of COVID, people will be wanting to travel much closer to home. And partly that is a matter of confidence, and partly it is for very practical reasons, that should something go wrong, or the situation change, they can get home more quickly, or they can get home quickly. And you can see that in this slide here. If we look at the Pacific Islands and take New Zealand residents, for example, 41% of New Zealand residents said that they were more likely to travel to the Pacific than they might have been prior to COVID. And that equivalent proportion is 36% of Australian residents. So, a really very receptive audience, and an opportunity to speak to the market with the expectation that there will be a positive response. We also have something, and I guess acknowledging that we don't have a crystal ball, and that it's a little difficult to know exactly how this will play out, but it's reasonable to expect that we'll have some border controls in place for some time to come. And so to to a certain extent, we'll have a captive market over the coming months and potentially years, and a potentially less cluttered marketing environment. So again, not having a crystal ball, but what we would expect is that there will be intense marketing within the wider Pacific region. And we're already seeing here in New Zealand, for example, some of the Australian states are starting to re-emerge and to run campaign activity here in New Zealand. The same will apply very shortly, I'm sure, from New Zealand regions into the Australian market. And so within the wider Pacific region, I think there will be intense competition between Australia, New Zealand and Pacific Island countries. But for all of that, many other destinations globally are also likely to be focused on these short-haul markets, which means that we may have a period of time in which there's less competition in terms of in the marketing environment from destinations outside of the Pacific region. So there are a number of factors that give us, as I said earlier, a kind of unique window of opportunity to reframe the conversation in the New Zealand and Australian markets as far as Pacific Island destinations are concerned. So if we think about those points on the right as being our aspirations, I guess, over the next wee while to create a more multifaceted view of the Pacific region, to encourage more in-depth engagement, to give the market more reasons to visit more destinations more often. All of those objectives will be served by a very strong focus on destination differentiation. So with differentiation in mind, I want to talk for a few minutes about different approaches that we might take to differentiation, approaches that are available. And I'm going to talk through each of these in a little bit more detail shortly, but broadly speaking, we identified 6 different bases for differentiation, whether that be price, service, distribution channel, market or market segment, product or experience, and brand, all as potential approaches to differentiation. Whatever approach is considered or taken, we also identified that there were 4 key questions or points of by which to evaluate those approaches. And these questions should be kind of the filter or the frame for evaluating proposed approaches to differentiation. So one is, will the point of potential differentiation meet a market need? Is there market demand for a destination with that point of difference? Is that point of difference credible to the market based on what is currently known about the destination? Does the destination have the product or the service or the capacity to substantiate that point of difference? So there may be no, to use an extreme example, there may be no point in focusing on a high service, high point of service as a potential differentiator if that's not able to be substantiated by operators in destination. And the 4th point, which is obviously very important, is the point of difference desirable to destination decision makers? So, does it have the support of people in destination, whether they be policy makers, marketers, operators, or actually the community? Does that point of difference have the support of the community? And I think that that's actually a really important point, and there's a lot of discussion right now about how important it is for tourism industry globally to consider social license in thinking about how they redevelop their industry. So bringing the community along, making sure that the point of difference is actually something that has the support of the community is really important. So just to talk a little bit about each of the potential approaches to differentiation. Price-based competition is one way of approaching differentiation, but typically that requires a destination to drive significant volume to compensate for a lower value, if you like, per visitor. What it tends to do is to prioritise price-sensitive consumers because margins are thin and yield is low. It does challenge reinvestment in the destination, and I mean generally it's not a recommended approach if the objective is to grow value. With service, I mentioned service before. A differentiation based on service can be really difficult to sustain when really a high level of service delivery is now expected as a norm. So I think it's quite difficult territory now from a tourism perspective to carve out a point of difference. Channel or channels of distribution, there's definitely some scope to differentiate through use of different channels, whether that's to forge exclusive trade relationships or to achieve superiority in the management of direct to consumer channels. But there are some difficulties in creating a point of difference there, given that there's quite a common mix of channels used across the Pacific at the moment. Market or market segment. So, I mean, this is really fertile territory for differentiation. If a destination has a demonstrated strength in a given market or a unique or competitive product offering, and I think we certainly saw through this research that one or more of the destinations that we looked at in the research did have a particular strength in a particular market or market segment, and we'll give some examples of that in a moment. Product is a really interesting one because to some extent it's difficult to create a point of difference around many product offerings simply because the consumers believe that you can do most activities in most destinations. So there are unique landscapes, there are unique cultural offerings, and there are unique experiences right across the Pacific. But it's actually quite difficult to build differentiation around a particular product or a particular experience. But it can be very, very useful as a way of substantiating other points of difference. And again, we'll come back to that in a moment. Brand or brand positioning, brand values is also fertile ground for differentiation, but it's really critically important that that is substantiated by the visitor experience and destination. Otherwise, it's not authentic. You know, to say one thing and deliver another is just not a sustainable position. So whatever the brand position and the brand voice that is taken needs to be substantiated or reflected in the nature of the visitor experience. Okay, so just as some examples based on the destinations that we looked at in the Pacific Destination Differentiation Research. So, so the research suggests that, for example, a strategy of market-led differentiation for, say, for Niue, could focus on particular motivational segments, demographic segments, and or special interest segments. And so Niue, and the way in which Niue is seen in the market would really, and the way and the segments that it's currently strong in, would definitely reinforce the idea of focusing on consumers who value time out, who want to disconnect from the stresses and pressures of their everyday life, and to have to have freedom of exploration and discovery. So as a motivational group, that would be a really appropriate target for Niue. Whereas, say, with Samoa, as a motivational segment, because of the strength of that destination's positioning in relation to family and family relationships, motivational segments that relate to people who are seeking quality time with their friends and family, wanting to travel, to build relationships, to learn about the local culture and to interact with the local culture. Those segments would be appropriate targets for Samoa. Both of those destinations are strongest in the New Zealand rather than the Australian market, whereas Solomon Islands and Vanuatu currently have higher market penetration in the Australian market. So, you could argue that that a very strong focus, but primary target market for both Niue and Samoa could be New Zealand, with Australia as a secondary market. Then there are demographic segments that are worth targeting based on an existing strength or the alignment with a product offering. So special interest segments as well. So Niue is very well positioned to take advantage of nature and wildlife, people interested in nature and wildlife. Samoa is very well positioned to market the country as a destination for significant family events, weddings, unveilings, special birthdays or anniversaries. Solomon Islands has a particular strength in terms of history and heritage, and Vanuatu in relation to diving and eco-adventure. So taking a market-led differentiation position based on market-led differentiation would cause a destination to focus in different directions. If we looked at a strategy that was based on brand-led differentiation, again, just using these four destinations as examples, we could see some quite different positions taken based on current perceptions and perceived strengths of those destinations. So Niue, a place to disconnect from the stress and complexity of everyday life. Samoa, a place to connect with the people you love and a culture in which family and relationships are treasured. Solomon Islands, a place of discovery and new experiences for the intrepid traveller. And Vanuatu, a vibrant mix of nature, culture and indulgence with something for everyone. So quite kind of rich territory to explore and quite significant differences across destinations, but at the same time really reinforcing that there are some very strong values of the Pacific brand, the Pacific Islands brand, on which to build these points of difference. So, those values of warmth, welcome, safety, and accessibility are so critical, and so very important, and will be very important coming out of COVID-19 as well. That sense of warmth, welcome, and safety. So these points of difference can be built on top of those region wide brand attributes. Now, as I mentioned earlier, it's quite difficult to build a strategy of differentiation purely on the strength of product or experience, because there is a high degree of commonality, even if there are some unique landscapes, some unique wildlife, some unique cultural experiences in each country. So what we've suggested is that while product or experience-led differentiation might not be recommended as the basis for differentiation, it's still critically important to substantiate market and brand-led differentiation. So if, for example, with Samoa, we were talking about a brand positioning based around family and relationships and connection with local culture, then that might be supported by the kind of heroing of products such as those shown there, staying in beach ballet, any opportunities to connect with Samoa, and opportunities to explore Samoa on your own independently. So that point is really summarised, I guess, in this slide. And apologies, there's an awful lot of content on here, but I'm not sure, Paul, if you mentioned at the beginning that the intention is that we will share a copy of the presentation, and obviously a copy of the report will be shared, and all of this detail is in the report. So plenty of opportunity to look a bit further later. But what we're demonstrating here is really the alignment between market focus, the target market segments, brand values, and substantiation in terms of product and experience. So if we then go back and think about these four fundamental questions that relate to the basis for differentiation, this framework here is really designed to show how those general principles or general questions might be applied in thinking about if you like, a short list of approaches to differentiation. And I think, Ross, you're going to pick up with some comments and examples there. Oops, you just muted. Yep.
Yes, look, mindful of time, and Christine has covered a lot of this already, and look, you'll be able to see this level of detail and more in the report. These are just very high level summaries here about some of the things that we found out in speaking to the consumers and speaking to the travel trade and some of the NTOs and operators in each country. So rather than go through, row by row, just say a couple of examples I can pull out here. Say for the Solomon Islands, we saw really strong alignment between the positioning, the sort of the marketing promises that are out there in the market, and the experiences on the ground. And that's, you'd say that's good for a destination, even though the Solomon Islands is challenged, through access, price, and then getting around within the Solomons. But certainly, consumer feedback and satisfaction with experiences there are rated very highly. One comment in particular saying that, all the challenges of travel is really well worth it for what you experience when you're there. So very good alignment with the marketing message and what's on the ground. Samoa, slightly less so. We saw just that the marketing message is very much around, yes, around Samoan culture, but also around beauty and beautiful. That didn't seem to be reflected with consumers, and so there seemed to be a little bit of a gap there, or a misalignment between what is being promised and what the market was kind of perceiving Samoa to be about. So maybe there's a bit of work in that space to do to bring that closer together. Certainly the market was saying, you know, we really see Samoa as a sort of very cultural, spiritual, family-oriented destination. So you could say, well, if we want to drop a whole lot of adventure product in there, would that actually work? Don't know. Might do. Throw enough money at it for long enough, maybe it would. But it would raise, you know, questions when people kind of are more thinking about the Solomons, Vanuatu more, you know, in terms of that eco, nature, adventure sort of destinations rather than Samoa. So these are just a couple of things that stood out to us from the research. Anyway, yeah.
Okay, no, thanks, Ross. And I think just to maybe sum up also with standing back from that level of detail and reflecting on some of the key takeaways, if you like, from the research, both the demand and supply side research. I think, you know, one point we came away with very clearly was, given the significance of word of mouth, marketing support really needs to be accompanied by investment on the ground. So it's become more and more a case, you know, over the last decade, and probably you know, increasingly so, that the experience will speak for itself. So because of social media, because of the dominance of word of mouth and sharing information about destinations, it's really important that there is that alignment between marketing and experience. So, you know, that all the messaging in the world will not overshadow, you know, the actual delivery of the experience. So for all that there needs to be, and particularly coming out of COVID-19, for all that there needs to be a really significant investment in marketing, there needs to be at least as significant an investment in the activity, the experience, the on the ground delivery of the tourism experience. I guess also just reflecting again on points of difference, what we walked away from this thinking was that we need to focus on shoring up and communicating those key points of difference. So that may mean doing less, but doing it really well, so doing it thoroughly. So being very clear about a destination's points of difference, and then focusing really quite single-mindedly on those points of difference. Trade relations, thinking about distribution channels. Trade relationships are going to be critical post-COVID, I mean, without a doubt. So we know that consumers have been burnt by their experiences when everything fell apart, you know, with the onset of COVID. We know that consumers will be looking to trade, possibly more than they were prior to COVID, because they believe that should anything go wrong, they will have better backup and support. So we know that trade relationships are critical. But having said that, direct-to-consumer capabilities are also important. And so having a multi-channel strategy, having capabilities and relationships, both trade and direct-to-consumer, is important. Also reflecting on the findings, you know, for all the focus on points of difference, and that differentiation is important going forward, we still need to have a very clear focus on the fundamentals. So safety, quality, cleanliness. So in everything that we're doing coming out of COVID, again, thinking about safety, visitor safety, thinking about quality, thinking about cleanliness. So those were really just a handful of the key takeaways, if you like, from this research. Really interested to get your views, you know, as NTOs. I'm not sure if we have any airline representatives on the webinar today, trade, and in fact program managers. I mean, what are the points that you take away from the work that's been done here and the points that we've covered today? So really just want to, at this point, perhaps open up for discussion and reflection from others.
Christine, hi, it's Paul here. Given that we had a late start, we might let anyone who wants to go, but just a couple of summary comments. Before we probably ask people to provide any questions through you or through SPTO. So thanks, Christina Ross, for the presentation. Thanks everyone for your patience with the technology glitches. We apologise for that. Tina, I'm assuming that the report will now be available on SPTO's website for people to access, is that correct?
Hi, Paul. We can make that available today.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. I guess as far as feedback's concerned, we're particularly interested in hearing from Pacific NTOs. This is another tool in your toolbox as you plan your COVID recovery strategies and activity. It's not the answer to everything, but it certainly, hopefully, will be helpful to you as you sharpen up your marketing focus in the future. On a really positive note, this work does show the pent-up demand for travel to the Pacific in the current environment that we're in. As borders open, things are looking good for a reasonably rapid recommencement of travel to the Pacific, and shows definitely the opportunities to value add in Pacific tourism. Just a quick sign-off message from us. In the future, NFAT will work closely with SPTO to further support Pacific NTOs with their work, primarily around digital capability, sustainability programs, and further market insights and sector analysis. If you have any particular requests, Pacific NTOs, about market research and insights that would assist you in your marketing and communications planning or product development, please let us know through SPTO. We'd love to get your thoughts on that. So a final sign off from me, but Christine, maybe we could leave the questions to happen via emails, is probably better.
Perhaps I'll just share again the contact details for anyone who would like to get in touch. So either with Tina at SPTO, or please contact me directly if you do have any questions about the research, and we'll come back to you on those. So thanks, Paul, and we have recorded the presentation, so I will also send that through. Tina, to